Welcome back to Fund Your Future with DRS. Today, our guest is Chris Clark, who's an economics professor at Washington State University in Pullman. And he's gained a bit of internet fame for making economics more approachable by posting videos on Instagram and TikTok. And if you want to follow him there, you can follow his handle on both those platforms is at Econ Chris Clark. We'll put that in the description of the podcast. And Chris, it looks like as of January 2025, you've had over 125,000 followers on TikTok. So that's quite
Yeah, I've
the
been pretty lucky.
accomplishment.
Thanks.
Congrats.
Yeah, I've been pretty lucky.
Nice. And I'll also mention that Chris, if you watch any of his videos, has quite the beard game going on here. I think you're quite famous for your beard style. Is that right?
Well, that's notable coming here, living in the Pacific Northwest. I got started on TikTok down in Texas, where long beards are a little more rare. But then I moved up here in the past few years, and I realized there's a few more of us.
Yeah, there's a whole culture around that. So if you watch any Chris's videos, you'll get to see his beard. Yeah, so just to kind of get started, like I mentioned, Chris has a lot of great videos on TikTok. I've followed you on Instagram. I especially loved the video you posted recently where you were asked how the Hawley Smoot tariffs contributed to the Great Depression. And then you get really into detail in all your videos, explaining and citing your sources. And it's just a really great resource for folks to be able to understand these econ topics.
Oh yeah, I mean these things move the world. Everyone has to participate in the economy, but the economy's big and fat and huge and complicated. But everyone has to be a little economist just to function. So I hope to any piece of context, like the current tariff question, for example, is just huge because we haven't seen tariffs this size for 90 years. So there's a whole lot to pack there and learn more about it.
Yeah, that's fantastic. 'Cause that kind of leads into my first question. So, how did you get into teaching economics and kind of what ignites your passion for it?
Well, when I was an undergrad, I couldn't figure out what to major in. Like a lot of students, everything was kind of interesting. I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. Oh, that's kind of cool. And then I realized economics is a field that studies almost all social interactions of all kinds. So you could do the economics of X or the economics of Y. And I realized I didn't really have to pick a major. I just stick in econ and keep studying everything.
I love it.
That also rings a little bit true for me, as I think I was an econ major for about a quarter. It seems interesting, and you dive into the topic, and yeah. So what have been the biggest challenges for you as an economics professor? Kind of, you mentioned this kind of right off the start that it touches everything, but as you're working with people who are new to the subject, I imagine in your undergrad classes, like what sort of challenges do you have in talking about economics to somebody who maybe doesn't even understand what economics is?
Right. I mean, any challenge for a principals instructor, teaching freshmen in a survey course at the beginning is trying to see this big picture how the world works and then relate it down to and how we all see the world when we're 18. We're just finished high school. Some of us are just barely starting to read the news, barely starting to see how things are going. And it's to kind of ignite and say, hey, there's this big world and this is how it works. And that's always a challenge. The biggest economic issue today in America would probably be housing affordability, right? But how many 18-year-olds are thinking about mortgages? Nobody is. So here's the biggest issue, and yet I have an audience who, is on a meal plan or some dorm situation, and so it's, trying to make all of these very adult topics interesting to folks who are just barely starting their adulthood.
I love that because it's actually very similar when you talk about personal finance to people. Like they talk about how, we should be teaching more personal finance in high school and college. And then it's like, but you have to teach the right, so like no 17-year-old is interested in the mortgage lending rates because it's like, it's not realistic to you at the time.
Oh, they're not gonna get a mortgage for another decade. So like, why teach it now? They don't have the question. There's no curiosity yet because you can only teach when there's curiosity. And there has to be a need to spur that curiosity in the first place.
That also reminds me about how at DRS we talk to people about pensions, but people usually aren't curious about their pension until they're 55 or 60.
Yeah.
Like it starts to become real for folks. And so it's one of the things I really appreciate about your videos as well, is that you're trying to figure out how to make these topics real to people in their daily lives.
Sure. I mean, in the case of housing, why should an 18-year-old care about that? One, they vote. and policy affects these things. So they should be well informed. And then two, you start saving now, compound interest, blah, blah, blah. Eventually you get your down payment, and then there's also the hope. Because housing is less affordable, a lot of students don't have the hope. So talking about a plan, and there's these FHA loans that you only need 3.5% down to get started, not the full 20. Those things kind of build hope when they're young, so they can start planning for it in the future.
Yeah. Do you try to use modern pop culture references in your classes to help kids understand?
Yes. Now, the one that came off the top of my head is not very modern. Mel Brooks did this History of the World, and his character is in Rome, and he's a stand-up philosopher. So he's unemployed, right? So stand-up philosophy is just not a thing, right? So he's in an unemployment office, and he goes and collects an unemployment check, and he's dotting the I's and crossing the T's and check boxes. And it's the same type of bureaucratic system we have today for how you qualify for unemployment. So that's always fun to do things like that.
Of it. So, what do you think is one example of an idea from economics that you think our audience would benefit from?
Oh, it's the one we learn in day one, week one, but it's just one of the crucial things of decision making. And I find outside of economics, other fields don't take it as explicitly. And what we call it is opportunity cost. So opportunity cost is the entire cost of making a decision. Usually when you make a decision, you have your costs on one side, you have your benefits on another side. But if you go to a movie, for example, the cost is not just the $10, $15 you're shelling out for the film or the gas that you got to get there, but it's the 3 hours of time. What else could you be doing with that time? So if you do this in the middle of the day, well, now you're foregoing work. So, if you're 18 and you're making $16 an hour, that's 45 plus dollars that is costing you in opportunity. But if you're spending money in general, so in the personal savings, am I going to save for the future, or am I going to consume now? The opportunity cost of consuming today is always that foregone future interest that you could have got had you decided to save. So you have to keep that into your total cost benefit, because some things can make sense if you do, okay, yeah, I like this movie. This movie's worth $16 to me, but is this movie worth $60 to you? That's a very different question, right? Is it worth the 3 hours? What else could you be doing with those 3 hours?
That's fascinating. I'd actually really never thought about that way. I guess I've never studied econ too much. Yeah, but yeah, the opportunity cost of that, all of that.
Well, I think we've talked about this on some previous episodes, Jenny, about things about like side hustles, and if people are trying to save more money and how you're spending that time. If I'm trying to get my own side business off the ground, and what are the best uses of my time, promote that effort or build my own skill set. And it's similar in a job setting as well, as kind of your own job. What are the things that are going to provide me the most benefit? I think some of our teachers deal with this. Is it worth it to get a master's degree or some advanced degree for the additional earning power that's going to get me in the future? There is an opportunity cost of I can't spend that time with my family or doing other things that I might enjoy more right now.
That is true. We kind of talk about that time versus money conversation.
Exactly what this is. Yeah. Yeah.
Chris, are there some other topics that might be like misunderstood or misconceptions about economics that you deal with either in your class or kind of that you pick up through all your interactions with people on the internet, that people have this thought of something that works in economics that maybe doesn't work as they think it should?
So economics is the study of the allocation of scarce resources, right? So it's a huge field, and we study lots of things, and there's some things we know really, really well, and there's some things that we're still learning more about. And I think a misconception is economists claim to know everything. And, especially when you go on TV, you don't always get a good sense of how strongly does the entire field know, like what's the quality of our knowledge. So especially big macro questions, like we don't know how to predict recessions. No one on the planet has a tool or a system that can consistently predict recessions every time. We can forecast, but the quality of our forecasts are really only okay. So we can't forecast the macroeconomy excellently. So questions of like, is the stock market going to crash? Who knows? Is the unemployment going to go up? And what we just experienced in the past few years is inflation. We understand a little bit about inflation, like we understand how recessions work. But then the second part for these macro questions is, okay, we understand a little, but can we even do anything about it? What policies work? And we do know some about recessions. We know that stimulus can help ease recessions, but we still have lots of open questions about what's the right size of a stimulus. Can we control inflation? Only a little bit. When the Federal Reserve changes interest rates, it's kind of a big bludgeoning tool. It's not a fine, like, we can't like control it like you can your vehicle. But then other things. So those are things we don't know very well. We know some, but we don't know it very well. But other things we know really, really well are like supply and demand, like the basic, like microtransactions. If you increase demand, price is going to go up. And we can fine tune this. Like if we get a data, we can plug it into a supply and demand model and we can get you a pretty close prediction of that individual price and the individual quantity and how it will change. So some things we know really, really well. And then other things we don't know that well. And I think what happens is when you have public conversations with an economist is you'll say something like on the issue of housing, we understand housing really well. We just got to build more. Like that's the only solution. Whatever we do, we have to build more. And then people say, oh, but you couldn't predict the financial crisis. I'm like, well, yeah, those are two different questions.
I was going to say, obviously, you use a lot of research. And what are just kind of like some top websites that you use or resources that you like to go to for various topics? Like you said, either how the economy is doing or the housing crisis or whatever it is.
Where's my information diet?
Yeah.
Well, the cool thing about the online world we live in is if you follow a ton of experts, because no economist knows everything, right? So some economists will specialize in real estate, and other economists will specialize in inflation, like all these things. So you go on Twitter or other places on social media, and you curate your For You page, as it were, full of just the world's best experts from across the planet. And that's just one of the coolest things. But in terms of like specific websites, oh, there's lots of blogs. I got a buddy, he's another teacher. He writes Monday Morning Economist, and that's a newsletter that's every Monday that's really quite good. I mean, Substack is kind of the growing place for high quality blogging. So Monday Morning Economist, I recommend that one. Noah Smith, he's very, very famous, but he'll do lots of political commentary or other types of things too, in addition to just economics. And Kyla Scanlon, I can always plug her. She's a friend from TikTok and Instagram and stuff. Kyla Scanlon does a lot of finance commentary, and she's very, very excellent.
Great. I'll have to check those out. Yeah.
Chris, you kind of mentioned this in a previous answer about the misconceptions about the economy and the stock market and how sometimes our thinking gets jumbled up about that. I'm just wondering if you might want to expand a little bit on that. I know one of my favorite quotes from economists is about how like 11 out of the last 5 recessions were predicted correctly by the stock market. Like I feel like since 2020, I have lived in a world like where every person has told me there's a recession that's going to happen in 3 months.
Oh my God, the doomers.
Right. And I've been hearing that since March of 2020. And
yeah. Well, they were right. March 2020, we did have a major recession, but it only lasted 2 months.
Right.
Yeah, you're touching on a couple things. One, I'll just say briefly, I'll answer the question, but I got to take a tangent and talk about doomerism and going viral and being on the internet. It's not just social media. Doomerism, so that's when a very negative headline is going to go further and going to make more money. I remember, so every Friday we get new unemployment data, and I would show my class, here's the media reporting about the unemployment data that just came out this month. So I'm sorry, not every Friday, once a month, the first Friday of every month, we get unemployment data. And I remember we had the lowest unemployment rate in 60 years. Like you had to go back to the moon landing to get 3.5% unemployment. And CNN figured out how to turn that into a negative headline. I'm like, this is one of the best jobs reports. I mean, we were experiencing inflation, and that's a bad thing. But on the job side, we were doing really well. They figured out how to make these really doomer negative headlines for a long time. I remember Bloomberg had that famous headline, 100% chance of recession. I think they said that in 2022, and here we are, we didn't get one. So that's doomerism. Doomerism goes more viral. So take that into account when you're trying to know what is really happening in the world around us. And the only way to really do that is a representative sample, and a representative sample of what's really happening in the economy. So when I say the unemployment rate, they interview 60,000 households every single month. And then they go to 600,000 businesses and see how many jobs they've created. These are huge, very carefully scientific representative samples of what's really happening to people. Now, the stock market is none of that. Stock market is simply a bet about the future. And bets about the future sometimes are right, and bets about the future are sometimes wrong. I mean, if the economy's doing bad, the stock market's going to be doing bad, right? But sometimes the stock market can go up when the economy is doing bad because they think, hey, in the future, the economy is going to recover. So that's why in COVID, even though the unemployment rate jumped to 15%, stock market recovered very fast and like exploded. Why? Because they were like, hey, we're going to get out of this. They all took that bet and they were right. We did get out of it. The economy recovered incredibly quickly. The stimulus packages worked wonders in terms of making sure people weren't suffering in 2020 and early 2021. And so I think that's the difference. Stock market is a bet about the future, and it's a noisy bet like any betting market would be. And it's only representing some companies, like the Dow Jones is like 29 companies. The S&P 500, okay, 500 companies, but it's only the biggest 500 companies, not the smaller ones. And then there are only companies that trade stock. Half of businesses aren't on the stock market. So it's only reflecting a sliver of the economy. It's an important sliver, but it's not the same thing as actual dollars and people's experiences on the ground.
Thank you for that. That's really a good way to think about, like you said, doomerism and stock market and all of those pieces that make up economics.
So I think like when you're interpreting the stock market in relation to the economy, you have to know why it's moving. Like what are the narratives? What are people saying? So right now at time of recording, the stock market has lost 6 months worth of value, for example. And so the question is this just like betting noise? Should we be worried about this? Because the unemployment rate is looking pretty good right now. Well, what's causing the narrative? And the question is, are these trade disruptions? Are these trade disruptions going to affect the real economy? And of all the things we know really well, we've been studying trade in earnest for 250 years. It will slow down the economy. We're going to be living a little less than potential because of these trade disruptions. So I think here the stock market is getting this relatively accurate. So I guess the question for the future is, well, how much will the magnitude be?
And for the record, we're recording here in March of 2025.
Yep.
I would be curious just because I would just love to pick your brain on inflation. I mean, I think many of us, and you're relatively young, like Jenny and I, like never lived through inflation. I mean, I remember growing up and hearing stories from my parents about people waiting in line for gasoline for, half a day. And like
Oh,
these, right, like these stories that I just never would have assumed that my life could be impacted by inflation. And now to this degree, and now I can't go outside without people telling me how much they paid for eggs. And I guess from an economist point of view, how do you help people understand what inflation is and how it impacts them day to day and then also over the course of their lifetime?
Yeah, inflation's complicated. People have good intuition that, its prices go up, therefore my quality of life is going to go down. Everything's more expensive. My paycheck is not going to go as far. And there was some truth to that, especially in 2022, kind of at the peak. I mean, in June 22, the annual CPI was at 9%. That's the highest we had seen since like 1980, which is long before any of us were born. But people close to retirement age now certainly remember it. So what is it? There's these short run costs where your paycheck doesn't keep up, but then wages are a price. Wages are the price of an hour of labor. And just like all prices are adjusting in an inflationary period, wages too adjust. And we saw wages on average went up. Now, this isn't universal. Not everybody got a raise. Not everybody switched to a better job. But on average, people did. On average, wages eventually caught up and surpassed it. I mean, today in 2025, our wages have a better purchasing power than they did before the inflationary period. So wages eventually catch up. So what's the big like macro cost? Well, it's the disruption. It's all that noise that gets introduced in the economy. An economy runs well when there's more clear information, more clear expectations about the future. And when prices are suddenly changing, that disrupts everybody's plans and the transactions slow down and businesses don't invest because they're not quite sure what's going to happen in the future. So those are the kind of the disruptions from inflation. So I think for me, the biggest challenge is for people to recognize that your wages fluctuate with inflation just like regular prices do. Because psychologically, we treat it as different. A lot of us don't realize that we're all just interacting according to these broad macroeconomic laws of how things interact. We all want to believe that we control our destiny. So everyone's like, a wage, well, I earned that. I went out and got a new job. And you did. I went out and negotiated a better pay or treatment from my boss. And you did. But that's just a cog in a big machine. People negotiating, people working hard to get better wages is just the same thing as when businesses see demand go through the roof and raise the price. It's all just functioning to these big macroeconomic supply and demand rules. So they view prices going up as something that's happening in the system, but they view their own wages going up as something they earned. So it's kind of this interesting psychological asymmetry.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. It's something that's being done to me versus something I am doing. And
Yeah.
I mean, a little bit to your doomerism comments as well. Like the things I can't control oftentimes are the things that keep me up at night the most. So
Yeah.
It's the great lesson of let's focus on the things that we can control, like our budgets.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, Chris, I remember when I was in college, the book Freakonomics was really popular. Obviously, there are a lot of economic books out there. Do you have maybe 3 book recommendations for our listeners?
Okay. I'm going to do first off a contemporary book with Freakonomics, but it's better. It's held up better, and that is The Undercover Economist by Tim Harford. So it's like 20 years old ago. It came out like in 2005, but this book still holds up. And I always feel guilty like with it being the first one off the bat because I'm like, well, maybe some of it's a little dated, but it's not. I mean, you're going to get examples from the last millennium, of course, but it's the best conversational discussion of basics like how is rent determined, how is land rent determined, and more profitable places for why is a hot dog $10 in Manhattan but like half the price or even a fraction of the price at Costco. A lot of that has to do with land rent. It's just the best introduction. It's conversational, got tons of great anecdotes. So Tim Harford's Undercover Economist. So my second book that I'd like to recommend is also from my friend Kyla Scanlon. In This Economy is the name of it. Say, how are things
Nice.
this back? And she goes into the Fed and finance and how all these things work. She's got nice little drawings throughout the whole thing. It's a lot of fun. And then the third book just coming out, so I've only had a chance to read the first few chapters. I got lucky enough to get an advanced copy, and it's by Daryl Fairweather called Hate the Game. And it's the economic cheat codes for life, love, and work. She is the chief economist at Redfin. That's the real estate website. And she also is on social media and makes these really great informative videos just to talk about how we navigate through this game of the economy. So the economy is this big game, and a lot of times the economy is very unfair, very unforgiving, but the more we know about it, the better we can navigate it. And I think she does a really good job at kind of unlocking that for the individual navigating it. And it's well written, lots of great anecdotes, lots of good advice, and she's an excellent economist to boot.
Awesome. I love that. Well, I think that's a great segue into like the theme of this podcast episode and all the reasons for why people should be interested in economics, follow it, follow Chris on Instagram and TikTok.
Econ Chris Clark.
Yes. Econ Chris Clark, his handle on Instagram and TikTok. All the reasons why we should be following economics, and the better we can understand it, the more we can make great predictions about the future.
Well, it was a real pleasure being on. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chris. We really appreciate it.
Good luck, everybody. Go retire. Be ready to retire when it's time.
Thanks for listening, and now we'd love to hear from you. What topics would you like to hear about? What questions do you have for us? Send an email to drs.podcasts@drs.wa.gov. That's drspodcasts@drs.wa.gov. The Department of Retirement Systems provides this podcast as a public service, but it's neither a legal interpretation nor a statement of DRS policy. References to any specific product or entity do not constitute an endorsement or recommendation. The views expressed by guests are their own, and their appearance on the program does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. Views and opinions expressed by DRS employees are those of the employees and do not necessarily reflect the view of DRS or any of its officials.